They brought her to him at dusk, when the winter sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The three men from town rode up to his isolated homestead, their horses kicking up plumes of fresh snow that glittered in the weak lantern light. Thomas Cain watched them from his porch, his hand resting on the axe handle leaning against the wall, not as a threat, but as a familiar comfort. He knew their faces. Sheriff Brody, puffed up with the petty authority of his badge, and two of his usual cronies from the saloon, their grins mean and stained with tobacco. They had a fourth figure with them, a small person huddled on the back of Brody's horse, wrapped in a coarse gray blanket and wearing a deep hood that shadowed her face completely. He knew this wasn't a social call. The town of Redemption had long since decided what it thought of him, and he had long since stopped caring. They saw a man who kept to himself, who didn't drink at their saloon or pray in their church, and they mistrusted him for it. He'd bought this land, worked it until his hands were cracked and permanently stained with dirt, and asked for nothing. That, in itself, was an offense. Their presence here was a violation, and he felt the familiar, cold knot of anger tighten in his gut. Brody swung down from his horse, his boots crunching loudly in the profound silence of the high country. "Cain," he said, the single word an insult. "Town council had a meeting about you." Thomas remained silent, his gaze flat and uninviting. He didn't ask. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Brody's grin widened. "Decided you must be lonely out here, all by yourself. We figured we'd bring you some company." He reached up and hauled the small figure from his horse. She stumbled in the snow, catching herself with a quiet gasp that was stolen by the wind. It was a woman, small, slight, and swallowed by the gray prairie dress she wore. The hood kept her face hidden. "The railroad left a few strays behind," Brody continued, his voice slick with mock generosity. "This one was available. No papers, no people. A gift from the good folks of Redemption. A wife for the lone wolf of the mountain." The other men laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the pines. It was a joke. A cruel, public joke meant to humiliate him and discard a human being in one single, wretched act. He saw it all in a flash. Their smug faces, their belief in their own power, their utter disregard for the woman who stood shivering in the snow. His anger wasn't hot. It was glacial. It froze the words in his throat and sharpened the edges of the world. He looked past them, at her. She didn't move, didn't look up. Her stillness was absolute, a rock in the middle of their jeering river. He wondered what she was thinking, what horrors she had already endured to end up here, a pawn in a game of small-town cruelty. He could refuse. He could send her back with them, let her face whatever fate they'd cook up for her next. The thought was a sourness in his mouth. He'd seen what Redemption did to people it considered strays. He wouldn't be part of it. He finally shifted his gaze back to Brody, the silence stretching until it became a weapon. "Get off my land," he said. The words were low, devoid of emotion, but they carried the weight of the mountain behind them. Brody's smile faltered. "Now, Cain, that's no way to thank us for our charity." "I'm not thanking you," Thomas stated. "I'm telling you to leave." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The finality in his tone was enough. Brody held his stare for a moment longer, then shrugged, a theatrical gesture of dismissal. "Have it your way. Don't say we never did nothing for you." He and his men mounted their horses, their laughter returning now that they were at a safe distance. As they rode off, their dark shapes swallowed by the twilight, a final taunt floated back on the wind. "Enjoy your mail-order bride, Cain." Then they were gone. The sound of their hooves faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and colder than before. It was just him and the woman in the gray hood, two strangers stranded together at the edge of the world, bound by an act of casual malice. The wind picked up, whipping snow around her still form. She hadn't moved an inch. The biting wind seemed to settle in the space the men had left behind, a cold and hollow presence. Thomas stood on the porch, motionless, listening until the last echo of their horses was gone, absorbed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His anger remained, a solid, heavy thing in his chest, but it was now directed outward, at the distant lights of the town he could just barely see shimmering in the valley below. A town full of men who could look at another human being and see only a joke, a piece of property to be disposed of for their own amusement. He finally let his eyes rest on the woman. She was still in the same spot, head bowed, the gray hood hiding any feature that might tell him who she was or what she felt. She looked fragile, like a winter bird that had fallen from its nest, yet her stillness had a strange strength to it. It wasn't the cowering of a frightened animal. It was a deliberate, contained waiting. He knew what she was expecting. She was expecting him to be like them. She was expecting cruelty, or a rough hand, or a demand. The thought settled uneasily within him. He was not a gentle man by nature. The land didn't allow for it. But he was a man who understood the difference between strength and brutality. The men from town had made a terrible mistake. They thought they were testing him, mocking him. What they had actually done was hand him a responsibility he never asked for, but one his own stark moral code would not let him refuse. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the snow. The sound made her flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He stopped a few feet away from her, careful not to crowd her space. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the aspen trees. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, clenched at her sides. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "They're gone," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She gave no sign of having heard him. He tried again, his words measured and direct, stripped of any artifice. "You can come inside, out of the cold." He didn't move toward her. He didn't make a gesture to lead or pull her. He simply stated the choice and waited for her to make it. It was the only thing he could offer her in that moment, the dignity of a decision, however small. For a long moment she remained perfectly still. He thought perhaps she hadn't understood, or that her fear was too great. He could feel the cold seeping through his own coat and imagined how it must feel through her thin dress. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. He still couldn't see her face beneath the hood, but the movement itself was an answer. She took a hesitant step toward the cabin, then another. He turned and walked ahead of her, not looking back, giving her the space to follow without feeling pursued. He opened the cabin door, letting a rectangle of warm, yellow light spill out onto the snow. He stepped inside and held it open, waiting. She paused at the threshold, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue of the twilight, before finally crossing it and entering his home. The quiet click of the closing door was deafeningly loud. Inside, the cabin was a single room, Spartan and impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling and spitting, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden planks. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a bed built into the far corner, and shelves holding a few books, tins of supplies, and neatly folded blankets. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, ordered life. Thomas moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He gestured toward the chair closest to the hearth. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a command, but a simple instruction. May moved toward the fire, her steps quiet on the floorboards. She didn't sit immediately, but stood before the flames, holding her hands out to the warmth. He watched the way the firelight caught the edges of her gray hood, the way her shoulders were held in a rigid line of tension. He turned to the cast-iron stove, ladling a thick, savory stew into a bowl. He'd made enough for 2 nights, a habit born of efficiency, but it felt like a strange sort of providence now. He set the bowl on the table along with a spoon and a piece of hard bread. He didn't speak again, simply went about his own business, giving her the gift of his inattention. He took off his heavy coat, hung it on a peg by the door, and began to clean the mud and snow from his boots. He was acutely aware of her every movement, every shift in weight, every soft rustle of her dress. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a palpable thing on the back of his neck. Days bled into one another in a silent routine. Thomas would rise before dawn, tend to the fire, and head out to the barn to see to his few cattle and the horse. When he returned, there would be a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. He never saw her make it, but it was always there. She moved through his space like a ghost, a quiet presence who took up almost no room at all. She ate the food he prepared, her portions small and neat. She kept the cabin tidy, sweeping the floor and washing the dishes with a silent efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. She never spoke, not a single word. He never pressed her. He would talk sometimes, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet space. He didn't ask her questions. He would just state facts. The bay mare is favoring her left foreleg. We'll have more snow by nightfall. The well is low. He was speaking as much to himself as to her, narrating the rhythms of his life, but he was also extending a thread into the silence, letting her know she was a part of this small world now, whether she chose to respond or not. One evening, a week after her arrival, he was sitting at the table trying to decipher a letter from a supplier in a town 2 days' ride away. The man's handwriting was a frantic scrawl, and a key phrase about the price of grain was completely illegible. Thomas squinted at it in the flickering lantern light, muttering under his breath. Looks like he's asking for $10 a sack. Can't be right. Robbery. He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. Suddenly, a quiet voice, clear as a winter stream, cut through the silence. It says 2, not 10. The loop of the T is open. Thomas froze. The voice was soft, low, and carried no discernible accent. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make, other than that initial, terrified gasp in the snow. He looked up slowly. She was standing on the other side of the table, her gaze fixed on the letter. She had pushed her hood back. For the first time, he saw her face. It was not the face of a broken creature. It was fine-boned and intelligent, her dark eyes clear and direct. There were lines of exhaustion around them, a deep sadness in their depths, but there was also an unmistakable spark of sharp intellect. He stared at her, completely stunned. The cruel joke the town had played had suddenly twisted into something far more complex. This woman, this silent stray, was educated. He looked from her face back to the letter, then back to her. He felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Who was she? Where did she come from? He had 1,000 questions, but he asked only one, his voice quiet. What is your name? She met his gaze without flinching, her expression unreadable. My name is May. The name hung in the air between them, simple and profound. May. It wasn't just a name, it was an identity, a claim on personhood that the men from Redemption had tried to strip from her. Her speaking, her literacy, it was all a quiet declaration. I am not who you think I am. The dynamic in the small cabin shifted irrevocably. The silence that followed was no longer one of fear or uncertainty. It was a silence of contemplation, of recalibration. Thomas looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a victim to be pitied, but a woman of hidden depths. He pushed the letter across the table toward her. Show me, he said. She leaned forward, her slender finger tracing the spidery script. "Here," she pointed. "The ink blotted, but you can see the curve. It's a W." He wrote $2, not 10. Her analysis was swift, confident. He nodded slowly, accepting her correction without argument. A flicker of something akin to respect, sharp and unfamiliar, sparked within him. He'd spent years prizing self-reliance above all else, and here was a woman who, despite her circumstances, possessed a competence he hadn't anticipated. From that night on, things were different. He began to speak to her not just about the ranch, but about other things. He'd pull a book from his shelf, histories, almanacs, even a worn volume of poetry, and read a passage aloud by the fire. He did it without expectation, simply sharing a small piece of his world. Sometimes she would listen in silence. Other times she would offer a quiet comment, a question, or an observation so insightful it would make him pause and reconsider his own thoughts. Their conversations were never about the past. He didn't ask where she learned to read English so perfectly, or how she came to be in the hands of men like Sheriff Brody. He understood that her history was her own, a territory too painful to be mapped by a stranger. He sensed that trust, for her, was a currency she could not afford to spend freely. Instead, he found himself wanting to earn it. He told her about his own past, not in a single confession, but in small, scattered fragments. He told her about his father, a stern man who had taught him that a man's worth was in his word and the sweat of his brow. He told her why he'd left the East, seeking a place where a man could be measured by his own actions, not the name of his family. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door, he finally told her why the town hated him. "There was a family," he began, his voice low, his eyes on the fire. "Homesteaders, from Ireland. The town didn't take to them, said they were dirty, that they brought sickness." He paused, the memory still raw. Brody and his men tried to run them off their claim, said it wasn't properly filed, which was a lie. I was there. I saw it. May listened, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, her gaze steady. "I spoke up for them," Thomas continued, "testified for them. The family got to keep their land, but I became an outsider, a man who sided with other outsiders." He fell silent, the unspoken part of the story hanging in the air. The family had eventually been driven out anyway, worn down by 1,000 small cruelties. His intervention had only delayed the inevitable and earned him permanent exile. He had tried to do the right thing and had failed. He didn't look at her, feeling the old shame of it. After a long moment she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You did not fail. You offered them a choice. You gave them a chance. That is not failure." Her words were a balm on a wound he hadn't realized was still so open. He looked up, and in her dark eyes he saw not pity, but a profound and unwavering understanding. In that moment he felt less alone than he had in years. The blizzard that had trapped them in the cabin for 3 days finally broke, leaving the world outside transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, muffling all sound and reflecting the pale winter sun with a blinding intensity. The air was sharp and clean, scoured by the wind. The enforced proximity had forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a quiet companionship built on shared silence and punctuated by brief, meaningful exchanges. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were two people navigating a shared existence, finding a rhythm in the simple, demanding tasks of survival. The peace, however, was as fragile as a thin sheet of ice. A week after the storm, Thomas was splitting wood when he heard the sound of approaching horses. It was too early for his supply run, and he had no other visitors. A cold feeling coiled in his stomach. He looked up toward the ridge and saw 3 riders, their forms dark against the snow. It was Brody and 2 of his deputies. They weren't riding with the casual swagger of their last visit. They rode with a purpose that felt menacing. Thomas set his axe down slowly and deliberately, his movements calm, betraying none of the tension gripping him. He walked to the front of the cabin, positioning himself between the approaching men and his front door. Inside, he knew, May would have heard them too. Brody reined his horse to a halt a few yards away, a smug, unpleasant look on his face. "Cain," he said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "Just making our rounds, checking on the welfare of our citizens." "I'm not one of your citizens," Thomas replied, his voice level, "and she is not your concern." Brody's eyes flickered past Thomas to the cabin door, a leering insinuation in his gaze. "Oh, I think she is. There's been talk that you're keeping her here against her will, a poor, defenseless creature like that." The hypocrisy was so blatant it was almost laughable. The men who had discarded her like trash were now feigning concern for her well-being. It was a pretext, and they both knew it. This was about power. It was about reminding Thomas of his place, about showing him that even out here, he couldn't escape their reach. "She is free to leave whenever she wishes," Thomas said, his voice dropping, becoming as cold as the air around them. "But she is under my protection. You will not bother her. You will get on your horses, and you will leave my land. Now." Brody laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Protection? You think you can stop us, Cain? There's one of you and 3 of us." He began to dismount, his intentions clear. In that instant, the cabin door opened. May stepped out. She was no longer the hooded, trembling figure from that first night. She stood tall, her face calm and composed. In her hands, she held Thomas's heavy Winchester rifle. She didn't raise it to her shoulder, didn't aim it at any one of them. She held it across her body, her grip firm and steady, a silent statement of solidarity. She was not hiding behind him. She was standing with him. Her presence changed the entire equation. The deputies shifted nervously in their saddles, their eyes darting from Thomas's stony expression to the rifle in May's hands. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone man and terrify a helpless woman. They found a fortress defended by 2 determined people. Brody stopped, his hand hovering over his own sidearm. He looked at May, a flicker of disbelief and fury in his eyes. He had intended her to be a symbol of Thomas's humiliation. Instead, she had become a symbol of his defiance. The silence was thick with unspoken violence. Finally, with a snarled curse, Brody swung himself back into his saddle. "This isn't over, Cain," he spat. "You're both outcasts. You'll see what this town does to your kind." Thomas didn't reply. He simply stood his ground, a silent sentinel, with May beside him, as the 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode away, their retreat a stark admission of their defeat. The threat lingered in the air, heavy and poisonous. But as he looked at May, at the quiet strength in her posture and the unwavering resolve in her eyes, he knew they would face it together. After the riders disappeared over the snowy ridge, the silence they left behind was vast and resonant. For a long moment, neither Thomas nor May moved. They simply stood in the biting cold, 2 still figures against the white landscape, the rifle a dark line of steel between them. The immediate threat was gone, but the echo of it remained, a poison in the clean air. Finally, Thomas turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. He saw no fear in her eyes now, only a calm, resolute fire. It was the same look he imagined he wore himself, the look of someone who had drawn a line and would die defending it. He reached out, his calloused, gloved fingers gently closing over the rifle's wooden stock. "I'll take it," he said, his voice low and rough. She relinquished it without hesitation, her hands falling back to her sides. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, a fleeting contact of warmth against cold leather, but it was enough to send a jolt of awareness through him. It was the first time they had touched. He turned and leaned the Winchester against the cabin wall by the door, its presence a silent promise. Then he looked back at her. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for what had just passed between them. Thank you felt too small. Are you all right? Felt insulting. She had proven herself more than all right. Instead, he simply nodded toward the open door. It's cold. Let's go inside. She followed him back into the warmth of the cabin. The fire was burning low, and he went to it immediately, stoking the embers and adding a fresh log. The familiar, mundane task was a comfort, a way to anchor himself after the confrontation. May moved to the stove, her actions as practical as his. She filled the kettle with water and set it on to heat. They worked in tandem, their movements weaving a silent dance of domesticity that was suddenly charged with new meaning. This wasn't just his home anymore, a place he defended out of solitary principle. It was their home, a sanctuary they had just defended together. The space felt different, smaller, and yet more fortified. When the tea was ready, she brought 2 mugs to the table, and they sat, one on each side, the flickering lamplight carving hollows and planes on their faces. The steam from the tea rose between them like a fragile curtain. He thought of all the things he should say, all the things a different kind of man might say. But he was who he was, a man of few words and deep currents. He looked at her hands wrapped around the warm mug. They were fine-boned but strong, hands that knew work. He remembered how steady they had been on the rifle. "You weren't afraid," he stated, the words coming out as a quiet observation rather than a question. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his across the table. She considered his statement for a moment before answering, her voice as clear and steady as her hands had been. "I have been afraid my whole life," she said softly. "It is a familiar room. Today, I chose to walk out of it." The simple power of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He understood. It wasn't about the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. She had not acted out of recklessness. She had made a conscious choice to stand, to fight back, to claim her own ground. He felt a profound, aching respect for her, an emotion so strong it was almost painful. The men from town had brought her to him as a joke, a thing to be used and discarded. They had no idea they had delivered a warrior to his doorstep. In the days that followed their stand against Brody, a new equilibrium settled over the homestead. The unspoken truth of their shared danger and mutual defiance became the bedrock of their relationship. The threat from the town wasn't forgotten. It lay coiled just beyond the tree line, a sleeping snake they both knew could strike at any time. But within the cabin's walls, and in the quiet expanse of the land around it, they cultivated a fragile but determined peace. Thomas began to actively include May in the workings of the ranch, not as a helper, but as a partner. It started with the rifle. One clear, cold afternoon, he took her out to a sheltered clearing behind the barn. He set up a few empty tins on a fallen log. "You held it," he said, handing her the Winchester. "You should know how to use it, properly." He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder to absorb the kick, how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly instead of jerking it. He was a patient teacher, his instructions direct and practical. His large, rough hands would occasionally guide hers, adjusting her grip, his touch impersonal yet conveying a deep sense of trust. May was a quick study. Her movements were precise and economical, her focus absolute. Her first shot went wide, the crack of the rifle echoing sharply in the winter silence. The second was closer. The third sent a tin can spinning off the log. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, and Thomas felt an answering warmth spread through his own chest. Seeing that brief flicker of pride on her face felt more rewarding than any successful hunt. Their partnership extended to other chores. He discovered she had a keen eye for detail. She noticed a loose shoe on his horse before he did, pointing it out with a quiet gesture. When he was mending a torn leather harness, she retrieved a small kit from her meager belongings and, using a curved needle and waxed thread, stitched the leather with such fine, strong seams that the repair was nearly invisible. He held the mended piece in his hand, marveling at the craftsmanship. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She paused, her hands stilling for a moment. It was the closest he'd come to asking about her past. "My father was a tailor," she said, her voice neutral. "He believed all hands should be useful." She offered nothing more, and he didn't press, but the small detail was another piece of the puzzle of who she was, a glimpse into a life before redemption, before him. Their evenings took on a comfortable ritual. After the simple meal, he would often read aloud, his deep voice filling the cabin. She would sit nearby, sometimes mending, sometimes just listening, her presence a quiet anchor in the room. He learned what she liked. She was less interested in the dry histories and more drawn to the poetry, to the way words could paint pictures of places she'd never seen. One night he was reading a passage about the sea. He glanced up and saw a look of profound longing on her face, a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull all the light in the room toward it. He stopped reading. "Have you ever seen the ocean?" he asked gently. She shook her head, her gaze distant. "No, but I have heard it is so large you cannot see the other side." "That's true," he confirmed. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of the fire. In that moment he understood that her dreams and sorrows were as vast and as hidden as the ocean she imagined. The isolation the town sought to impose on them became a tangible force as winter tightened its grip. The time came when Thomas could no longer put off a trip for essential supplies. Their flour was low, as was their salt, and he needed feed for the cattle that they couldn't produce on their own. He decided to bypass redemption entirely, opting for a longer, more arduous 2-day ride to a larger town called Clearwater, where he hoped his name and Brody's influence meant nothing. Before he left, he and May took careful stock of their provisions. He showed her exactly where the extra ammunition was stored and walked the property with her one last time, pointing out potential weak spots in the fencing. "Keep the door barred," he told her, his gaze serious. "Don't open it for anyone. I'll be back before the next storm front moves in." She met his eyes, her own expression unreadable but steady. "The snow is deep to the north," she advised. "Take the river trail. It is longer, but safer." He nodded, accepting her counsel. She wasn't just a charge to be protected. She was a strategist, thinking alongside him. The thought provided a strange comfort as he rode out at dawn, leaving her alone in the vast, silent landscape. Clearwater was a bustling, muddy supply town that catered to miners and trappers. It was a place of commerce, where a man's coin was supposed to be more important than his reputation. But Thomas quickly learned that Sheriff Brody's poison had long legs. At the Mercantile, the proprietor, a man he'd dealt with before, suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. "Sorry, Cain," the man mumbled, busying himself with a stack of hides. "Can't extend you any more credit." "I'm paying with cash," Thomas said, pulling a worn leather purse from his coat. The man shook his head, still not looking at him. "Can't sell to you. Heard you're causing trouble. Don't want any of that here." The same story repeated itself at the livery, where he tried to buy grain, and at the assayer's office, where he hoped to trade a few small nuggets he'd panned. Doors were closed to him. Whispers followed him down the street. He caught snippets. Keeping a woman captive. Stole her from the railroad camp. Dangerous man. Best to steer clear. Brody had done his work well. He had painted Thomas as a villain, a monster of the mountain, and May as his helpless victim. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. They were being starved out, not by force of arms, but by the slow, suffocating power of lies. He rode home empty-handed, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The 2-day journey back felt endless, each mile a testament to his failure. He had failed to provide, failed to protect her from the town's malice. As his homestead finally came into view, smoke curling from the chimney in a welcoming plume, a wave of dread washed over him. How could he tell her? How could he look into her calm, courageous face and admit that he had been defeated? He found her in the barn, pitching fresh hay for the cattle. She stopped when she saw him and noted the empty saddlebags. She didn't have to ask. She knew. Her gaze moved from the bags to his face, and she saw the exhaustion and grim defeat etched there. She said nothing, simply leaned the pitchfork against the wall and walked toward him, her steps sure and steady in the clean snow. He dismounted, the weariness of the journey settling deep into his bones. He felt the weight of his failure pressing down, a physical burden. He expected questions, perhaps even fear or accusation in her eyes. Instead, May simply took the horse's reins from his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You are cold," she said. "Go inside. I will see to the horse." Her quiet command brooked no argument. It was an act of profound care, of taking a burden from him when he was at his lowest. He watched her lead the horse into the barn with practiced ease, her small frame moving with a strength that was more than just physical. He went inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire doing little to thaw the chill inside him. He sank into the chair at the table, dropping his head into his hands. He had led them into a siege, a war of attrition they were destined to lose. When May came in a few minutes later, she moved about the room with a quiet purpose, stoking the fire and putting the kettle on. She didn't speak until she had placed a steaming mug of tea in front of him. She sat opposite him, her hands folded on the table. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He finally lifted his head, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "They wouldn't sell to me," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Brody sent word ahead, spread lies. They think I'm holding you here against your will." He laid the ugly truth bare between them, expecting her to finally break, to show the fear she was entitled to feel. She absorbed the information without a flicker of panic. Her expression remained calm, thoughtful. "Then they are fools," she stated simply, "and we will not be defeated by the words of fools." He stared at her. "May, we have enough flour for maybe 2 weeks, less for the cattle. They've cut us off. This is not a battle of words. They mean to starve us out before the spring thaw." "Then we will learn to live on what the mountain gives us," she countered, her voice unwavering. "When I was a girl, my grandmother taught me about the winter plants. The bark of the aspen can be made into flour. The pine needles hold more sustenance than you think. There are ways." He was stunned by her practicality, her utter refusal to surrender. He saw the wilderness through his own lens of struggle and labor. She saw it through a different lens, one of survival and hidden knowledge. That evening she proved her point. She took a handful of dried roots he had dismissed as inedible and boiled them until they were soft, mashing them into a surprisingly palatable stew, thickened with the last of their oats. It was a meager meal, but it was sustenance, a testament to her ingenuity. A new partnership was forged in that moment, one born of sheer necessity. His strength and knowledge of the land combined with her quiet wisdom and hidden skills. The following days were a blur of hard work. He taught her how to set snares, and her patience yielded 2 rabbits in the first week. She showed him which lichens were safe to eat and how to prepare them to remove their bitterness. He became the hunter, she the forager, their efforts intertwined. One afternoon, a sudden fever struck him. It came on fast, leaving him shivering and weak, his body racked with chills despite the blankets she piled on him. He drifted in and out of a delirious state, the world a confusing blur of heat and cold. Through it all, May was a constant, steady presence. She bathed his face with cool water, forced him to drink bitter teas made from willow bark, and sat by his side through the long, dark nights. He was vulnerable, completely at her mercy. In his delirium, he saw not a captive, but a guardian, her face a mask of fierce concentration and gentle care. She was protecting him now, her resilience the iron shield that kept him alive. He woke to the pale light of a new day, the fever broken. His body felt weak, scoured out, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. May was asleep in the chair by his bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. A deep, protective tenderness washed over him, so potent it made his chest ache. She had saved him. While he was helpless, she had not only tended to him, but had kept their fragile world running, chopping wood, tending the animals, ensuring their survival. She had faced the isolation and the encroaching winter alone, and had not faltered. As he lay there, watching the slow, even rhythm of her breathing, he understood that his duty was no longer simply to protect her from the outside world. His duty was to be worthy of the strength she had shown him. His recovery was slow, but with each passing day his strength returned. The bond between them deepened, forged in the crucible of sickness and survival. They spoke less, but understood more. A shared glance across the room, a small gesture of offering the last piece of bread, these became their language. The world outside the cabin remained hostile, a frozen expanse controlled by their enemies. But inside, they had created a pocket of fierce loyalty and mutual reliance. One afternoon, the wind picked up, howling down from the peaks in a furious gale. A blizzard descended upon them with terrifying speed, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of white. Snow piled up against the cabin, burying the windows, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight. The storm raged for 4 days, imprisoning them completely. It was during this time, cut off from everything, that the last of their reserves dwindled. They were down to a handful of dried meat and a small bag of the aspen bark flour. The cattle in the barn would be low on feed. The situation was dire. Yet, in the heart of the storm, a strange peace settled between them. They were a tiny island of warmth and life in an ocean of frozen chaos. There was nothing to do but wait, to endure together. On the third night of the blizzard, a loud, insistent banging on the cabin door startled them both. It was impossible. No one could be out in this storm. Thomas grabbed the Winchester, his heart pounding, every instinct screaming that it was Brody, come to finish them at their weakest. He moved to the door, motioning for May to stay back by the hearth. "Who's there?" he shouted over the roar of the wind. A faint, desperate voice answered, barely audible. "Help. Please. Lost." It wasn't Brody's voice. It was thin, reedy with exhaustion. Thomas hesitated, his mind racing. It could be a trick, but the desperation in the voice sounded real. To leave anyone out in this storm was to condemn them to death. He looked at May. Her eyes were wide, but she gave a single decisive nod. Trusting her instinct, he lifted the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, stumbled inside and collapsed onto the floor. It was a man, thin and dressed in the dark, simple clothes of a traveling preacher or doctor. Thomas and May dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen coat and gloves. The man was half conscious, his skin deathly pale, his lips blue. They worked quickly, chafing his hands and feet, forcing warm sips of willow bark tea between his chattering teeth. Slowly, color began to return to his face. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, fluttered open and focused on them. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch. My horse gave out. I thought I was done for." For the next 2 days, as the storm slowly blew itself out, they shared the last of their food with him, nursing him back to strength. Alistair was a man of quiet observation and deep empathy. He saw the Spartan cabin, the meager rations, and the profound, unspoken partnership between the stoic rancher and the fiercely resilient woman. He listened as Thomas, prompted by the doctor's gentle questions, explained their situation, laying out Brody's cruelty and the town's lies with blunt honesty. Alistair listened to it all, his expression growing more grave. On the morning the storm finally broke, revealing a world blanketed in brilliant sunlit snow, Dr. Finch was ready to leave. They gave him their last piece of dried meat for his journey. "I cannot repay you for my life," he said, standing at the door, his gaze moving between Thomas and May. "But I can offer the truth. I am on my way to the territorial capital. I have occasion to speak with men of influence, men who oversee marshals and judges. The story of what is happening in redemption will be told, and it will be heard." He reached out and shook Thomas's hand, then turned to May and gave a respectful bow. "Your courage and dignity in the face of such cruelty is a lesson I will not soon forget." With that, he was gone, a lone figure walking toward the sunrise. Thomas and May stood on the porch, watching him go. They didn't know if the doctor's promise would change anything. The future was still uncertain, a vast, untrodden field of snow. But something had shifted. The truth was no longer their prisoner. It was free. He looked down at her, standing beside him, her face turned toward the new light. The cruel joke the town had played was over. What stood in its place was something real, something earned, something stronger than any lie. It was a partnership, a fortress, a home. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of hope.